Hello and welcome. I'm the Pharaoh Nerd, and this week we'll be looking into a rather obscure and little understood pharaoh who I would argue is the closest figure in ancient Egyptian history to George Washington. Now, as far as I know, he never chopped down a cherry tree and he never wore dentures, but he did liberate his nation from what was then the world's most powerful empire. And that man's name was Amyrtaeus. Unfortunately, I don't have any depictions of him specifically, because he left no monuments and there are no depictions of him left. And out of the background. After around 125 years of Persian rule between 525 and 401 BC, he ejected all Persian forces from Egypt and brought about the last period of native Egyptian rule before the 20th century. He was also the only pharaoh ever to be categorized as their own dynasty, the 28th. Despite this, he himself was ousted from power just after he had consolidated it, and to make matters worse, almost nothing is known about his reign. But I pieced together as much information as I possibly could because today I'll tell the story of this revolutionary pharaoh. Amyrtaeus had, and I quote, impeccable credentials for any man wishing to claim the throne in his time. First, he was likely a descendant of the great 26th or Saite dynasty, which ruled Egypt between 664 and 525 from the delta city of Sais, before Egypt was first annexed into the Persian Empire. The classical historian Diodorus Siculus even states that the pharaoh who was ruling Egypt in the year 400 BC, who was almost certainly Amyrtaeus, but who he calls Psammetichus, was a descendant of the famous Psammetichus. Here he's referring to Psamtik or Psammetichus I, founder of the 26th dynasty. Amyrtaeus was also potentially the grandson of another man who had rebelled against the Persians that was also named Amyrtaeus. This Amyrtaeus had collaborated with another scion of the 26th dynasty and claimant to the throne named Inaros against Artaxerxes I around 460 BC. But although that rebellion did pick up some traction, it was squashed and Inaros wound up getting crucified. Amyrtaeus' son Pausirus actually served the Persians, and he would then be Amyrtaeus' father. So maybe this allowed Amyrtaeus first-hand experience of how the Persian government worked, which would help him later. But otherwise, nothing else is known about Amyrtaeus' past. Regardless, we do know that Amyrtaeus proclaimed himself pharaoh around when Darius II passed away in 404, and some sources claim that he had been fighting a guerrilla war against the Persians since 411, around his home city of Sais, although I'm not sure what hard evidence there is to back this up. But you can't just say you're something and then magically be that thing. So Amyrtaeus' main concerns were ejecting all Persian forces from Egypt and consolidating his power. But for the first few years of his reign, he was confined to the Delta, and didn't achieve the former goal until the year 401. This is evidenced by papyri inscribed in Aramaic from the Jewish colony at Elephantine, the southernmost city of Egypt proper, which still acknowledges Darius' successor, Artaxerxes II, as pharaoh until 18th January of 401, which would be his fourth regnal year. The first document bearing Amyrtaeus' name comes from the same community and dates to June 400, which is dated to his fifth regnal year. Artaxerxes may have thus decided to abandon Egypt in 401 in order to deal with other troubles, specifically the revolt of a man named Cyrus the Younger in the same year, which is going to become a bit more relevant later. So what did Amyrtaeus do during his reign? Well, Amyrtaeus left no monuments, and aside from Elephantine, as far as I've seen, his name is only found among the Demotic ostraca found at one site in Karga Oasis, west of the Nile Valley. No versions of his name have ever been found in hieroglyphs, and the hieroglyphic spelling of his name can only be tentatively reconstituted from Demotic sources. But we do know that Amyrtaeus may have been a corruption of Amun-Ir-Disu, meaning Amun is the one who created him. Usually, pharaohs have 5 names, and some sources identify Amyrtaeus as his birth name, or nomen. Like all other Egyptian rulers between the 26th and 30th dynasties, his name is Libyan in origin. According to all derivations of Manetho, an important Ptolemaic history of Egypt, Amyrtaeus ruled for 6 years between 404 and 399 BC. But there are few details of what actually happened during Amyrtaeus' reign. There is one interesting little anecdote from it, though. As I stated earlier, Amyrtaeus is likely mentioned in Book 15 of Diodorus Siculus's Bibliotheca Historica. In it, he describes what the fate of Tamos, the leading supporter of Cyrus the Younger's aforementioned rebellion, was immediately after Cyrus's rebellion had been crushed. Tamos was the commander of Ionia, and he was born in Memphis, Egypt, although his family came from Caria in Asia Minor. Diodorus states that Tamos made the sensible decision to flee to Egypt with all of his possessions and all of his sons, except for one poor guy named Gloss, although it turned out he would be the lucky one in this situation. Now, Tamos was probably expecting a warm welcome because of the good turn he had done the king in the past. Given this anecdote occurred in 400 BC, the king mentioned in it was almost certainly Amyrtaeus, but he is referred to as Psammetichus by Diodorus. This is probably just Amyrtaeus' throne name, the name he took upon assuming the throne, but the theory that this Psammetichus was also a rival claimant to the throne has been raised, although there is otherwise no evidence for his existence. The text also gives us a cryptic comment about how Amyrtaeus had an obligation to Tamos because he was his suppliant, and also refers to Tamos as the pharaoh's friend. But despite all this, Amyrtaeus promptly murdered Tamos and all of his kids in order to seize the fleet Tamos had brought with him and all of its cargo. So I guess it turns out that Amyrtaeus wasn't exactly a saint. See why Gloss was so lucky? But Tamos' choice to flee to Egypt and the cryptic comment made on Amyrtaeus' obligation to Tamos suggests that maybe, just maybe, Amyrtaeus had given covert support to Tamos' rebellion. After all, it gave Amyrtaeus the edge he needed to defeat the Persians. But as I said earlier, Amyrtaeus' reign would end abruptly just a year later in 399 BC. The Demotic Chronicle, a text which chronicles the pharaohs of the 28th to 30th dynasties, says that a violation of the divine law occurred during Amyrtaeus' reign and that he was caused to remove himself upon his throne while he was alive, and I quote. So as you can see, the Demotic Chronicle isn't afraid to pull some punches. It basically frames Egypt's history between Amyrtaeus and the start of the Second Persian occupation as dominated by repeating expressions of divine wrath against royal iniquities. It also states that his son wasn't allowed to succeed him. So basically, Amyrtaeus was deposed. But by who? Well, a guy by the name of Nepherites or Nepharud, who began his own short-lived dynasty, the 29th, which is pretty interesting in its own right. Just like Amyrtaeus, Nepherites hailed from a city in the Delta, this time a city called Mendes. Just like with Amyrtaeus' ousting of the Persians, the ousting of Amyrtaeus is luckily sort of documented by another Aramaic papyrus from the Jewish garrison at Elephantine. This fragmentary letter, now held in the Brooklyn Museum, mentions both Amyrtaeus and Nepherites, but only dignifies Nepherites' name with the royal protocols. The letter also seems to mention Amyrtaeus forcefully being taken to Memphis and Nepherites' coronation in October or November of 399 BC. And let's just say that they probably weren't taking Amyrtaeus to Memphis to throw him a party. He was probably executed. But no source ever explicitly says he was, so maybe, just maybe, he survived. And if he was relatively young when he became pharaoh, maybe, just maybe, he could have met Alexander the Great when he came to liberate Egypt from the Persians for a second time. That theory definitely isn't going to win me any academic awards, but hey, it's sort of fun to think about. Amyrtaeus' fall is the first example of the squabbling that occurred throughout the 28th to 30th dynasties, and Egypt's last stage of independence, inducted by Amyrtaeus, would continue to be dominated by dynastic infighting and different great families of the Delta vying for power, influenced by various sectional interests like the priesthood. Within 20 years, the 29th dynasty had been replaced by the 30th, and soon after that, the last native pharaoh of Egypt was ousted by the Persians, and they proceeded to occupy Egypt yet again. But Amyrtaeus still achieved something huge, and although no one in his own time seemed to have much gratitude for that, and hardly any of the details of his life are known, not to mention how he was ruthless to the point of treachery, I still think what little there is to know about him is well worth knowing about.